With FPM starting to get a lot more popular, starting to mature a lot more in terms of features, and a lot more projects coming on that are publishing themselves in the FPM registry, you're going to start to come across a lot more FPM projects if you're a Fortran programmer. In this video, I want to give you kind of an anatomy, a layout of what an FPM project will look like, so when you come across one of these, you'll kind of already have your bearings and know what you're looking for. So there are two main types of projects in FPM that you're going to come across. The first is an app, which is basically a program, maybe in some rare cases a collection of related programs that are intended to be used for some purpose by an end user. So in theory, you wouldn't even necessarily have to know that it's using Fortran under the hood, but it's some program that some user is intended to be using. The other would be a library, and that's basically code that's intended to be reused in other projects. Some good examples are libraries for parsing command line arguments, or dealing with strings in a more convenient Fortran because that's tricky in Fortran, and some others. The first one we'll take a look at is an app. And basically one of the most straightforward way to kind of start getting an idea for the layout of an FPM package is to just create a new one. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to run the command fpm new, and we'll give it the -help option so we can kind of see what we're going to do. But for creating an app, we're going to basically use the example here. We're going to say fpm new. We're going to make it have a lib, an app, and a test components, and then we have to give it a name, and so we'll call it an FPM app. Right, so that's going to create a new FPM project for us. And we'll change directories into our new project, and we'll just use the tree command to get an idea for what does this look like. And so this goes ahead and creates the basic layout for an FPM application. So we've got an app, an SRC, and a test folder, and it creates a README for us, and an fpm.toml file. And that is basically the heart of an FPM project. And we'll take a look at that in more detail in a minute. But first we'll kind of go through the different directories that it's created for us and what goes into each directory. So the first thing you'll see is the app folder, and it's got this main.f90 file, and that is the main program. Any main programs that are in the app folder can be detected automatically, and FPM will build an executable out of those programs. For most cases, you'll only need one, and so you'll just have that one main.f90 in there. It can also include additional source files in there, but there's a caveat to sources that it finds in the app folder, and I'll touch on that in a second. The second folder is the SRC folder, and this is where library code goes. So the app, any programs in app can make use of any code in the SRC folder. What else can make use of code in the SRC folder is any programs in the test directory. So right here we've got check.f90. That is another main program, but it's intended to be used for testing purposes. So the tests can also use any code that is in the SRC directory, but they cannot use code that is in the app directory, and so that's the caveat that I mentioned a minute ago. Any code that is in app cannot be tested by your tests. So that's the reason that most programs, most FPM application projects, they will still have an SRC directory, because if you're doing good practices and writing tests for your code, the tests need to have access to it, and so you're going to want to put that code in the SRC folder. So you generally will see a very minimum amount of code in the app folder, and most of the code will be in the SRC folder. And so with an FPM project, for the default layout like this, if I use the command fpm run, if there's a single program, it will compile and run that program for me. I can also use the command fpm test, and if there is a single test, it will run that test program for me. So that's the gist of kind of how you interact with an FPM project. If it's an application, you can also run Fpm Install, and that's going to take the executable and put it in a default location, but you can also be more specific and tell it where you'd like that application to be installed, so you can use it from other places. And so now we'll come back to the fpm.toml file, which is the heart of an FPM project. And let's take a look at what is in that file. It's going to give the name of the project and a version number, a license, the author name and emails, so you'll potentially know how to get in contact with them, copyright information. This, by default, you don't actually need the build section in the TOML file, but it puts it there for you by default, because these all default to being true. And this is telling FPM that it can auto-detect the executables, tests, any examples, yada yada. And the install also the defaults to false. This is saying that we're not going to install the library along with the executable, because in most instances you don't need to do that. But this is the heart of an FPM project. So there's lots of other stuff that you'll typically find in an fpm.toml file. So one of the good ways to kind of get a feel for the stuff you'll find on a regular basis is go and look at some TOML files from some different FPM projects. But the documentation is actually really good as well. So I'll quickly show you where you can find that. So the main project lives on GitHub at github.com/fortran-lang/fpm. The README file contains pretty good information for getting started using FPM. But one of the couple of the most important things you'll want to look at in terms of documentation, the manifest reference here. There's a link to that towards the bottom of the README. This is the reference for what things are allowed and can be specified in the TOML file. So as you can see, you've got the name, version, license, etc. Some of those top level items that you can define. Some configuration options for the build section. You can specify some options for the library, but you can also specify some non-default things for your executables and your tests. So we'll take a quick look at the examples of those real quick. But the gist is you can be explicit about the different executables that you want to have FPM be able to build and run, and you can put them in non-default locations, and then you can specify where those are. And finally, one of the key things about FPM is it allows you to really easily specify and make use of other libraries as dependencies for your project. And so that's the thing you will see most often, and we'll take a look at those as well. So first, let's take a look at how you can specify some non-default stuff. For your library code, if you want, you can put your code in a folder other than SRC, but you have to tell FPM that you've done that, and that goes in the library section, and you say that the source dir is in where you put your source code. Specifying specific targets. So by default, if there's a main program in the app folder, FPM will find it and be able to compile and run it. If you want to put those programs in a different location, or you want to be explicit about some other things, then you create a new executable in the TOML file. You tell it the name of the executable, what folder it's found in, and the name of the source file that contains the main program. You can also specify additional dependencies that are specific to a given executable as well. So you can say that this executable's extra dependencies are something. And that dependencies thing actually comes in handy for some other aspects of how FPM works as well. When we get to the dependencies section, we'll talk a little bit about that. You can also have example programs, and I'll get to that when we talk about libraries. But they contain basically the same information as an executable. And similarly for tests, your tests are run with FPM test, so you can specify more than one test program and give some other the same information about that you could for executables. You can give that same information for your tests as well. Now we'll come down here to specifying dependencies. So the main selling point of FPM is it makes using third-party libraries in your project really easy. In the dependencies section, you specify a project that you want to depend on, where FPM can find it. Right now, it only supports fetching from Git repositories, but you can specify a branch, a specific tag, or even a specific commit that you want to be used as the version for specifying a version of that dependency that you want. And there's a couple of variations and ways you can specify those. This is an example of a different way that you can specify it instead of doing it all on one line. And so when we go to talk about libraries, we'll talk about how these dependencies are transitive, meaning that if you depend on a library and it depends on some additional libraries, then automatically you will depend on those additional libraries. You won't have to re-specify them in your project. It can be good practice to do that if you are actually making use of them in your project, so that it is clear that, hey, these are the things that I'm using. But you don't necessarily have to. If one of your dependencies already depends on that, then you're already getting it. You don't have to specify it, but like I said, sometimes it's good practice to be clear about what are the things you're depending on directly. And next, there's not an example here, which probably we will add soon. But you can actually specify what we call dev dependencies, and these are dependencies that you may need for programs or your tests, but that you don't necessarily need for the library. So this would be an instance where I've got, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about libraries. These are dependencies that somebody who's making use of your library, they won't need, because your library doesn't depend on them. But you might need them for your tests or your programs. Another thing you might want to go take a look at is the packaging guide. This gives a lot more kind of use case based examples of here's how you might write a program, here's how you might design write a library, here are the things that will go into your fpm.toml file. So this is kind of the tutorial kind of version of the documentation. So let's go back, and now we can take a look at an example library. So that second use case where your project is intended to be used by others. So let's create a new library project. So we'll use the fpm new command, and we'll still have a lib and a test, but instead of app, we'll do example here, and we'll call it an fpm library. And we'll change directories into there. And run that tree command and see what's in there. And so now you'll notice the difference between a library and an app is, instead of the app folder, now we have the example folder. And by having examples instead of apps, that signifies to a reader or somebody coming and looking at your project that these aren't programs meant to be like used as, some tool that somebody's going to make use of. They're more demonstrations of how you might use this library. So that will kind of give you the distinction between a project that's intended to be some tool that somebody will use versus a library that some application developer is going to make use of in their project. So you'll still write the vast majority of the code in the SRC folder, and this is any code that's in that SRC folder. That's what somebody who's going to make use of your library, that's the code that they're going to have access to. You'll still write your tests the same way as you would for a program. So all the tests and test programs go in the test folder, but all of your kind of example use cases of how you're going to use that. Hopefully your tests are good examples of how you might make use of the library. But if you want to have some more simple examples of like demonstrations of how you might make use of the library in some application, the examples are where you're going to write that code and the programs that will run to kind of demonstrate how it works. But then with a library, you will see in that fpm.toml file. For a new project, you won't see it obviously because it only creates the default things. But what you will see in most library projects is the key thing you'll want to see there is what are they depending on? What additional dependencies am I going to bring in by making use of this library? Because you get those dependencies automatically. So now if I depend on a library, I also depend on whatever it depends on. So you'll want to know about that. And so you'll want to investigate that if you're trying to decide whether to make use of some library. And so that's kind of the gist of the layout for an FPM project, whether it be a library or an application. To really start to get a handle on things, let's take a look at a couple of example projects. We'll take a look at a couple of my example projects. Let's start off by looking at my project for the ISO varying string type. This was a functionality that was written with the intention of being included as part of the Fortran standard, but didn't actually end up making it into the standard. It was kind of abandoned. But this is an example implementation of what that functionality would have been. This would have been a new type that was added to the language for handling varying length strings. And I've written this as an FPM project. So you'll see that I do have an FPM toml file here. You'll see the source and the test folders. I don't have example programs. The tests are pretty decent documentation of how you might use it, because most of the functionality is just implementations of the intrinsic functions that already exist for character variables. And the original document describing what would have been added to the standard is also a really good documentation as well. So you could look at that. But the key thing that we're looking at here is like, hey, if I might maybe be wanting to make use of this library, let's start by looking at the fpm.toml file and figure out what's going on with this library. And so you'll see I've got the name, I've got a version, I've licensed it with the MIT license, my name and email address if you need to get in contact with me as the maintainer. Copyright, I wrote this in 2020, so that copyright's 2020. And you'll notice that I don't have any dependencies. This library is standalone, but I do have dev dependencies. If you want to run the tests, you need my unit testing framework, vegetables. So if you depend on this library, if you want to use this library, you don't actually get extra dependencies along for the ride. If you want to locally, clone the repository and run the tests, the dev dependencies will get cloned so you can run the tests. But you won't end up depending on vegetables just because you used my varying string library. Using the varying string library doesn't depend on vegetables, so you won't either because we have this dev dependency section. You can see I have lots of actual test programs, so I made them explicit here so you can see what are all of the test programs I've got and what are their names going to be. So you can kind of start to get the lay of what's going on in here, and then you can go and start investigating what tests do I have. You can start looking at those, and you'll kind of have an idea of what you're looking at, what you're looking for. So let's go take a look at a slightly more complicated library. So this is my JSON library, JSON for Fortran. And again, it's an FPM package. It's a library, as you can kind of tell now, because I don't have an app folder, but I do have an example folder. And so you could go and look in there and see a main program that kind of demonstrates how you would use this library. For purposes of this demonstration, we're interested what's in this fpm.toml file. If I want to make use of this library, what else comes along for the ride? So we'll take a look at the fpm.toml file, and you can see now I don't have that whole list of extra tests. I've basically, all my unit tests are in one program. They're in the test folder. All of the defaults are just fine for FPM, so I don't need to go and be explicit about that stuff. I do have the dev dependencies because I depend on my unit testing framework. But if you use the library, if you're not using my unit testing framework, you don't need to depend on it just to use this library. But now I do have dependencies that if you're going to make use of this library, you need these additional dependencies as well, because this library makes use of these other things. These are the other things that it depends on directly. So it's got some error handling stuff, so I use my error handling library. It uses ISO varying string a lot. It uses my parser combinator library and some additional kind of helper string functions in a library that I've got as well. And so it depends on these things directly. And so if you want to know all of the dependencies you're going to end up with by trying to use this library, you might want to go investigate, well, what do these things depend on, and you might want to go see what are all of the dependencies that are going to come along with this, because there's going to be a whole tree of them. In this case, I believe this is all of them, because I depend on all of them directly in this library, so there's no transitive dependency that you're going to end up with that isn't listed here. But in other projects, you might want to make sure and you go and investigate that, so you do know what are all of the things that I'm going to get along with this library. Sometimes the joke is I wanted a banana, but I got the gorilla too and the whole jungle surrounding him. And so you might want to make sure that just because I'm grabbing this one dependency, this one library I want to use, make sure I'm not getting the whole jungle along with it. But that's kind of the gist of the layout of an FPM package. So you'll know where to start if you want to, start looking at a project that's using FPM. You'll know to go straight to the fpm.toml file, see what it says, and that'll give you the basic layout of the project. If all of the defaults are there, now you'll know what all of the defaults are, and so you'll know where to go find different pieces of the project. But if it's specified some things explicitly, well, then you'll know what's different. And you'll know where to go start looking for the things you're interested in about that particular project. I hope this was helpful, informative. If you enjoyed it, make sure you click that like button, subscribe, hit the bell so you'll get notifications when I put out new videos, all that fun stuff. And hope to see you around next time.